tiny feathers in the morning light, fluttering softly, taking flight. Buzzing hums in the meadow's breeze, a symphony among the trees. Little wings of wonder in the air, dancing freely without a care. From the skies to the forest floor, nature's beauty forevermore.
Little Wings of Wonder. Episode 8. Daily Lives and Behaviors of Hummingbirds. The Hidden World of Hummingbird Society. Brought to you by the 1940s, romance murder mystery novel Underlying Love, a Worthington, Ohio mystery, and by the Little Wings of Wonder book series. To truly appreciate hummingbirds, one must look beyond their dazzling appearance and remarkable flight capabilities to understand the complex behavioral patterns that govern their daily lives. These tiny birds lead surprisingly intricate social lives, following elaborate protocols for territory establishment, mate selection, and resource management that rival those of much larger animals. Their behaviors reflect millions of years of evolutionary refinement, creating survival strategies perfectly adapted to their high-energy lifestyle and specialized ecological niche. The daily existence of a hummingbird unfolds according to rigid energy calculations, where every decision must balance caloric intake against expenditure. Unlike birds that can afford leisurely feeding or extended periods of inactivity, hummingbirds must constantly monitor their energy reserves while maintaining vigilance against competitors and predators. This perpetual balancing act creates behavioral patterns that appear hyperactive to human observers, but represent finely tuned responses to environmental demands. Understanding hummingbird behavior requires appreciation for their unique sensory world and cognitive capabilities. These birds possess spatial memory systems that allow them to remember hundreds of individual flowers and their nectar production schedules, time perception that enables split-second flight maneuvers, and social recognition abilities that help them navigate complex territorial relationships. The combination of these capabilities produces behavioral repertoires that are both predictable and endlessly fascinating to observe. The seasonal rhythms that govern hummingbird behavior reflect the dramatic energy demands of migration, breeding, and molt cycles that compress a full year's activities into just a few months of intense activity. Each season brings distinct behavioral priorities that shape everything from feeding strategies to social interactions, creating a constantly shifting behavioral landscape that challenges observers to understand the motivations behind the actions they witness. Feeding patterns and energy management. The economics of nectar collection. Hummingbird feeding behavior operates according to strict economic principles, where energy expenditure must never exceed energy gain by margins that would threaten survival. This fundamental constraint shapes every aspect of feeding behavior, from flower selection to territorial defense strategies, creating patterns that reflect sophisticated decision-making processes compressed into split-second choices. The optimal foraging theory finds its purest expression in hummingbird feeding behavior, where birds must constantly evaluate the energy content of available flowers against the costs of accessing them. High-quality nectar sources receive preferential attention, while marginal flowers may be ignored entirely if better alternatives are available. This selectivity becomes particularly pronounced during periods of high energy demand, such as early morning feeding or pre-migration fat loading. Feeding frequency varies throughout the day according to energy needs and flower availability, with most species requiring feeding sessions every 10 to 15 minutes during active periods. The brief duration of individual feeding visits, typically lasting only seconds, reflects both the high energy density of nectar and the need to minimize exposure to predators and competitors while feeding. Memory plays a crucial role in feeding efficiency, with individual birds maintaining detailed mental maps of flower locations, nectar production schedules, and competitor activity patterns within their territories. This spatial and temporal memory allows birds to optimize their feeding routes while avoiding unnecessary energy expenditure on depleted flowers or heavily defended territories. Flower handling techniques vary among species and individuals, with some birds showing remarkable specialization in accessing particular flower types. Bill length and curvature adaptations allow different species to exploit different flower shapes efficiently, while learned behaviors help individuals maximize nectar extraction from familiar flower types. Territorial defense and resource control. Territoriality in hummingbirds represents one of the most intense forms of resource defense found in the bird world, with individuals willing to expend enormous amounts of energy to maintain control over high-quality feeding areas. The economic value of territories is measured not just in current nectar production, but in the predictability and exclusivity of access to those resources over time. Territory establishment follows predictable patterns based on resource quality, with the most productive areas attracting the most dominant individuals. Prime territories typically include multiple flower types with overlapping bloom periods, ensuring consistent nectar availability throughout the territory holder's residence period. Secondary territories may focus on single, high-quality resources or collections of marginal flowers that collectively provide adequate nutrition. Defense strategies vary with territory quality and competitor pressure, ranging from simple presence displays to elaborate chase sequences that can cover hundreds of yards. The most valuable territories receive the most intensive defense, with territory holders maintaining constant vigilance and responding aggressively to any intrusion attempts. Territorial boundaries are maintained through a combination of patrol flights, strategic perching, and direct confrontation with intruders. Experienced territory holders learn to recognize regular competitors and adjust their defense strategies accordingly, often focusing most attention on the most persistent threats, while tolerating brief incursions by less competitive individuals. The energetic costs of territorial defense can be substantial, with dominant birds sometimes spending more energy on defense than they gain from exclusive access to resources. This apparent contradiction is resolved by understanding that territorial control provides insurance against resource scarcity and reduces the uncertainty associated with competitive foraging in undefended areas. Feeding site fidelity and learning. Hummingbirds demonstrate remarkable learning abilities when it comes to food source recognition and utilization, with individuals quickly adapting their behavior to exploit new opportunities while maintaining efficiency at familiar resources. This behavioral flexibility allows birds to thrive in both natural and human-modified environments where resource availability may change rapidly. Site fidelity to productive feeding areas can persist across seasons and even years, with returning migrants often attempting to reclaim territories they held during previous breeding seasons. This fidelity reflects both the value of familiar resources and the learning investment that birds have made in understanding local resource patterns. Artificial feeder utilization demonstrates hummingbird learning abilities, with birds quickly discovering and incorporating feeders into their feeding routines when these resources provide reliable, high-quality nectar. The rapid adoption of feeder resources by wild birds suggests sophisticated evaluation processes that can distinguish between natural and artificial food sources based on quality rather than origin. Innovation in feeding behavior occurs regularly as birds encounter new flower types or feeding opportunities. Individual birds often experiment with novel food sources, and successful innovations can spread through local populations as birds observe and imitate effective techniques demonstrated by their neighbors. Temporal scheduling of feeding activities reflects learned understanding of resource availability patterns, with birds timing their visits to coincide with peak nectar production periods for different flower types. This scheduling ability requires integration of internal timekeeping mechanisms with learned associations between time and resource quality. Courtship displays and mating systems. The theater of hummingbird romance. Hummingbird courtship represents some of the most spectacular behavioral displays in the bird world, combining aerial acrobatics, vocal performances, and visual demonstrations that showcase male fitness, while stimulating female reproductive responses. These displays have evolved under intense sexual selection pressure, creating behaviors that prioritize sensory impact over energy efficiency. Male courtship territories differ fundamentally from feeding territories, focusing on display sites that provide optimal conditions for aerial performances rather than food resources. These areas typically feature open spaces for flight displays, prominent perches for territorial advertising, and acoustic properties that enhance vocal performances. The establishment of courtship territories often requires males to abandon or reduce their investment in feeding territories, creating trade-offs between immediate survival needs and reproductive opportunities. Dive displays represent the most dramatic component of male courtship behavior, with different species performing variations on the basic pattern of ascending to considerable heights before diving at tremendous speeds toward perched females. These displays incorporate elements of speed, precision, and acoustic production that demonstrate male physical condition and genetic quality to evaluating females. The timing of courtship displays correlates closely with female reproductive cycles, suggesting that males can assess female receptivity through visual or chemical cues that remain largely unknown to human observers. Peak display activity typically occurs during early morning hours, when environmental conditions are optimal for both display performance and female evaluation of male quality. Species-specific display variations help maintain reproductive isolation between closely related species, while providing mechanisms for female choice based on display quality and precision. These variations can involve differences in flight patterns, acoustic components, or visual elements that allow females to distinguish between potential mates and evaluate their relative fitness. Mating systems and reproductive strategies. Hummingbirds employ predominantly polygynous mating systems, where successful males mate with multiple females while providing no parental care beyond sperm transfer. This system places intense pressure on males to maximize their attractiveness to females while allowing females to focus entirely on nest building, incubation, and chick rearing without male assistance. Female choice drives male reproductive success, with females evaluating potential mates based on display quality, territory quality, and male physical condition. The criteria for female choice vary among species and environmental contexts, but generally favor males that demonstrate superior flying ability, vocal performance, and territorial control capabilities. Breeding synchrony within populations helps ensure that peak male display activity coincides with female receptivity periods, maximizing opportunities for successful mating while concentrating reproductive effort during optimal environmental conditions. This synchrony is typically triggered by photoperiod changes and reinforced by environmental cues such as flower availability and weather patterns. Extra-pair mating occurs regularly in hummingbird populations, with genetic analysis revealing that social and genetic mating systems often differ significantly. Females may engage in mating with multiple males, potentially increasing genetic diversity in their offspring, while obtaining genetic benefits from high-quality males that may not be available as social partners. Reproductive isolation mechanisms help maintain species boundaries in areas where multiple hummingbird species breed sympatrically. These mechanisms can include temporal differences in breeding timing, habitat segregation during breeding seasons, or behavioral differences in courtship displays that prevent hybridization between closely related species. Nesting habits and parental care. The architecture of hummingbird nests. Hummingbird nests represent marvels of engineering that combine structural integrity with camouflage, insulation, and expandability in packages smaller than tennis balls. The construction of these tiny structures requires sophisticated material selection and assembly techniques that female hummingbirds accomplish entirely through instinctive behaviors refined over millions of years of evolution. Nest site selection reflects multiple factors, including protection from predators and weather, proximity to food sources, and availability of appropriate construction materials. Preferred sites typically feature sturdy horizontal branches or forks that provide stable foundations while offering overhead protection from rain and predators. The height of nest placement varies among species, with some preferring high canopy positions, while others nest closer to ground level. Construction materials vary geographically and seasonally based on availability, but typically include plant fibers, moss, lichens, and spider silk. The spider silk component is particularly crucial as it provides the elastic binding that allows nests to expand as young birds grow, while maintaining structural integrity throughout the nesting period. Females actively collect these materials, often traveling considerable distances to obtain high-quality components. The construction process follows predictable sequences that begin with foundation laying and progress through wall construction to interior finishing. The entire process typically requires 5 to 10 days of intensive work, with females making hundreds of individual material gathering trips while gradually shaping and refining the nest structure. Nest architecture varies among species in ways that reflect different environmental challenges and reproductive strategies. Some species construct deep, cup-shaped nests that provide maximum protection for developing young, while others build shallower structures that facilitate rapid fledging when predation pressure is high. Egg laying and incubation. Hummingbird reproduction involves the production of remarkably small eggs that nonetheless contain all the nutrients necessary to support development of complex organisms capable of flight within weeks of hatching. The timing of egg laying reflects careful coordination between female physiological cycles and environmental conditions that will support successful reproduction. Clutch sizes in hummingbirds are invariably small, with most species laying exactly 2 eggs per nesting attempt. This small clutch size reflects the energetic constraints of producing and incubating eggs while maintaining the high metabolic rates necessary for adult survival. The eggs themselves are typically white and measure only 10 to 15 millimeters in length, making them among the smallest bird eggs relative to adult body size. Incubation responsibilities fall entirely on females, who must maintain constant egg temperatures while continuing to meet their own nutritional needs through regular feeding forays. The incubation period typically lasts 14 to 19 days, depending on species and environmental conditions, during which females spend approximately 80% of daylight hours on the nest. Temperature regulation during incubation requires sophisticated behavioral thermostat mechanisms that allow females to maintain optimal egg temperatures despite environmental fluctuations. Females adjust their position on eggs, vary their metabolic heat production, and time their feeding absences to maintain consistent incubation conditions throughout the development period. Predation pressure during the incubation period is substantial, with nest concealment and female vigilance behavior representing primary defenses against egg predators. Females become extremely secretive during this period, approaching nests indirectly and freezing motionless when potential threats are detected. Nestling development and fledging. Hummingbird nestlings hatch in an extremely undeveloped state, lacking feathers, sight, and thermoregulatory ability, while possessing enormous appetites for the protein-rich diet necessary to support their rapid development. The transformation from helpless hatchling to flight-capable fledgling occurs in just 18 to 25 days, representing one of the fastest development rates found in birds. Feeding responsibilities during the nestling period place enormous demands on female hummingbirds, who must capture hundreds of small insects daily while continuing to maintain their own energy requirements. The protein requirements of growing nestlings cannot be met through nectar alone, necessitating intensive insect hunting that often takes females far from nest sites in search of adequate prey. Growth rates during the nestling period are remarkable, with young birds increasing their weight by 300 to 400% during their time in the nest. This rapid growth requires constant feeding, with females making feeding visits every 20 to 30 minutes throughout daylight hours while the young are in the nest. Behavioral development parallels physical growth, with nestlings gradually developing coordination, strength, and flight preparation behaviors during their final weeks in the nest. Wing exercises become increasingly vigorous as fledging approaches, while coordination tests help prepare young birds for their first flight attempts. Fledging typically occurs 18 to 25 days after hatching, with young birds leaving the nest during early morning hours when air conditions are most favorable for maiden flights. The timing of fledging reflects a balance between maximizing development time in the protected nest environment and minimizing exposure to predators that might discover the increasingly conspicuous nest. Post-fledging care and independence. The period immediately following nest departure represents a critical transition during which young hummingbirds must develop flight skills, foraging abilities, and territorial awareness, while remaining dependent on maternal care for survival. This period typically lasts 7 to 14 days, depending on species and individual development rates. Continued feeding by females supports young birds during their learning period while allowing gradual development of independence. Young birds follow their mothers and observe foraging techniques while receiving supplemental feeding that maintains energy levels during the intensive learning period. Flight skill development progresses rapidly during the post-fledging period, with young birds practicing increasingly complex maneuvers while building the muscle strength and coordination necessary for adult-level flying performance. Initial flights are short and clumsy, but improvement occurs daily as young birds gain experience and confidence. Foraging instruction involves both demonstration and practice, with females leading young birds to productive flower patches, while allowing increasing independence in flower selection and handling techniques. Young birds quickly learn to recognize profitable flowers while developing the precise motor skills necessary for efficient nectar extraction. Territorial awareness develops as young birds encounter adult territorial holders and learn to recognize and respond appropriately to aggressive displays. This learning is crucial for survival, as young birds must quickly understand the social landscape they will navigate as independent individuals. The role of insects in hummingbird nutrition. Protein requirements and insect hunting. While nectar provides the energy that fuels hummingbird flight and metabolism, insects supply the protein, fats, vitamins, and minerals essential for growth, reproduction, and maintaining body condition. This dual dietary requirement creates complex foraging strategies that must balance the accessibility and energy content of nectar sources with the nutritional completeness that only arthropod prey can provide. Insect consumption increases dramatically during breeding seasons, when females must support egg production and nestling growth. During these periods, insects may comprise 40 to 60% of female dietary intake by volume, requiring intensive hunting efforts that often take birds far from their established nectar territories in search of adequate protein sources. Hunting techniques vary among species and habitats, with some hummingbirds specializing in aerial hawking of flying insects, while others focus on gleaning stationary prey from flowers, foliage, or spider webs. These different techniques require distinct flight skills and behavioral strategies, with some birds showing remarkable specialization in particular hunting methods. Prey size selection reflects the constraints of hummingbird anatomy, with birds typically targeting insects smaller than 6 to 8 millimeters in length. Despite these size limitations, hummingbirds consume an impressive diversity of arthropod prey, including flies, gnats, mosquitoes, aphids, small spiders, and various other tiny invertebrates. Seasonal availability of insect prey influences breeding timing and success, with hummingbird reproductive cycles often synchronized to coincide with peak arthropod abundance. Climate variations that affect insect populations can have cascading effects on hummingbird breeding success and survival rates. Foraging strategies and habitat selection. Insect hunting requires hummingbirds to exploit different microhabitats than those optimal for nectar feeding, creating spatial and temporal complexity in daily activity patterns. Productive insect hunting areas often feature high arthropod diversity and abundance, such as edges between different vegetation types, areas near water sources, or locations with abundant flowering plants that support diverse insect communities. Weather conditions strongly influence insect hunting success, with warm, calm conditions typically providing optimal hunting opportunities. Wind, rain, and cold temperatures reduce both insect activity and hummingbird hunting efficiency, sometimes forcing birds to rely more heavily on stored fat reserves or alternative food sources during unfavorable weather periods. Web robbing represents a specialized foraging strategy where hummingbirds systematically visit spider webs to collect trapped insects while avoiding the spiders themselves. This technique provides access to pre-captured prey while reducing the energy expenditure associated with active hunting, though it requires precise maneuvering to avoid entanglement. Flower visiting for insects supplements nectar collection with opportunistic prey capture, as many flowers harbor insects that can be captured during normal nectar feeding activities. This dual-purpose foraging increases efficiency while providing protein supplements that might otherwise require separate hunting expeditions. Seasonal shifts in insect hunting behavior reflect changing prey availability and nutritional requirements throughout the annual cycle. Pre-migration periods often feature intensive insect hunting, as birds build fat reserves, while winter residents in mild climates may shift to more opportunistic hunting strategies that complement available nectar sources. Seasonal behavior changes, migration preparation, and departure. The behavioral changes associated with migration preparation represent some of the most dramatic transformations in the hummingbird annual cycle, as birds shift from territorial breeding behaviors to intensive feeding and fat accumulation that supports long-distance travel. These changes are triggered by photoperiod cues that initiate physiological preparations for migration while modifying behavior to support the enormous energy requirements of intercontinental travel. Hyperphagia, or increased feeding intensity, begins several weeks before actual migration departure, as birds build the fat reserves necessary to fuel their journeys. During this period, territorial behavior often relaxes, as the energy costs of defense become less important than maximizing caloric intake from all available sources. Molt timing coordinates with migration preparation to ensure that birds possess optimal flight feathers for their journeys, while avoiding the energetic costs of molting during travel. The precise timing of molt varies among species and populations based on their specific migration schedules and energy constraints. Social aggregations form at productive feeding sites during pre-migration periods, with normally territorial birds tolerating closer proximity to competitors, when resource abundance makes territorial defense less profitable than intensive feeding. These temporary aggregations can reach impressive sizes at particularly productive locations. Behavioral restlessness increases as departure time approaches, with birds showing increased activity levels and exploratory flights that may represent orientation testing or route reconnaissance. This pre-migration restlessness often coincides with weather pattern monitoring that helps birds time their departures to coincide with favorable conditions. Winter adaptations and survival strategies. Hummingbirds that remain in temperate regions during winter must cope with reduced food availability, harsh weather conditions, and increased thermoregulatory demands that challenge their energy-intensive lifestyle. Behavioral adaptations during this period focus on energy conservation while maintaining access to sufficient resources for survival. Torpor utilization increases dramatically during winter months as birds cope with cold temperatures and limited food availability. The ability to reduce metabolic rate by 90% during overnight periods becomes crucial for surviving extended periods of cold weather when energy expenditure would otherwise exceed energy intake. Resource tracking becomes more intensive during winter, as birds must locate and monitor the limited flower and feeder resources available during cold months. Winter territories often encompass larger areas than summer territories as birds travel farther to access scattered resources. Social tolerance increases during winter as the relaxation of breeding-related territorial behavior allows more cooperative resource use. Winter, aggregations at productive feeders or late-blooming flowers can include multiple species that would be mutually exclusive during breeding seasons. Microhabitat selection becomes particularly important during winter as birds seek locations that provide protection from wind and weather while maintaining access to food sources. Preferred winter habitats often feature dense vegetation for shelter and exposure to morning sun for warming. Breeding season transitions. The transition into breeding condition involves dramatic behavioral changes, as birds shift from survival-focused winter behaviors to reproduction-oriented activities that prioritize mate attraction and territory establishment over immediate survival needs. These changes are coordinated with physiological preparations that support egg production and reproductive activity. Territory establishment marks the beginning of breeding season as birds claim and defend areas that will support their reproductive efforts. The intensity of territorial behavior increases dramatically as birds compete for prime locations that offer optimal combinations of food resources, nest sites, and display areas. Courtship behavior development follows predictable patterns as males establish display territories and begin performing the aerial displays and vocalizations that will attract potential mates. The timing and intensity of courtship displays reflect male condition and experience, while providing information that females use in mate selection. Nest site prospecting begins as females evaluate potential locations for nest construction, while continuing to meet their nutritional needs during the energetically demanding period of egg production. The selection process involves assessment of multiple factors, including predation risk, weather protection, and proximity to food sources. Social dynamics shift dramatically during breeding season as the complex interactions between territorial males, choosy females, and competing individuals create fluid social situations that change daily as breeding activities progress. Understanding these seasonal behavioral patterns provides insights into the remarkable adaptability that allows hummingbirds to thrive in diverse environments while maintaining their specialized lifestyle requirements. The daily lives of hummingbirds unfold according to complex behavioral patterns that reflect millions of years of evolutionary refinement in response to their unique ecological niche. From the precise timing of feeding activities to the spectacular displays of courtship season, every aspect of hummingbird behavior serves specific functions in their ongoing struggle to balance energy budgets while successfully reproducing and surviving in challenging environments. Understanding these behaviors enhances our appreciation for these remarkable birds while providing practical insights that can help us create better conditions for their continued success in our changing world. If you liked what you heard today, consider purchasing other books by Bradley Barkhurst, including Underlying Love, A Worthington, Ohio Mystery. It's 1941 in the quaint village of Worthington, Ohio. Life is changing at the end of the Great Depression. Elizabeth Russo, 23, teaches elementary school, but feels uncertain about her future. Her Sicilian immigrant father ran the red and white a popular village general store. 5 years prior, Elizabeth's high school sweetheart Samuel left the village abruptly, leaving her with unanswered questions. Now engaged to George, the red and white's accountant, Elizabeth still can't forget Samuel. When her father tragically passes away and her mother goes to Cincinnati to help her ailing Aunt Gracie, Elizabeth is forced to be alone. Then one night, Elizabeth receives a phone call from her mother, asking her to come to Cincinnati to see her ailing aunt. Before leaving, and without notice, Samuel, Elizabeth's high school sweetheart, unexpectedly shows up in the village. Upon Elizabeth's return from Cincinnati, she hears a scream and sees a figure fleeing. The village banker, Mr. Collins, is found murdered, with suspicion falling on a local hobo. Elizabeth and her quirky neighbor, Betty Wimsfeld, investigate the murder. As they uncover village secrets, Elizabeth struggles with her feelings for George and Samuel. Will Elizabeth solve the murder mystery? Will she choose her stable engagement or risk rekindling an old flame? Find out in Underlying Love, a Worthington, Ohio mystery. Available through major book retailers and underlyinglove.com. Stay tuned for the next episode of Little Winged Wonders: Conservation and Challenges.